I became an expert at lying before I ever became an expert at anything else, not the dramatic kind of lying. Not the kind that unravels lives or burns bridges or sends people spiraling into ruin. Just the quiet, everyday kind. The kind that lives in the space between what people ask and what you actually answer. The kind that wears a long-sleeved shirt in July and calls it a fashion choice. The kind that schedules every doctor's appointment for Monday mornings when the clinic is least crowded and pays in cash so there's no insurance trail. My name is Connie Riley. I am 26 years old. I work as a junior architect at Hartwell and Bryan Associates, a mid-sized firm in the city that specializes in mixed-use residential development. I drink my coffee black. I take the third train, not the second, because the third one is less crowded and I can always get a seat near the door. I keep my hair just long enough to brush the back of my collar, and for 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days, I have worn a medical-grade compression sleeve on my left forearm every single day of my life. Most people assume it is an old injury. A sports thing, maybe, or a car accident. I have a handful of vague explanations ready depending on who is asking. My coworker Dana thinks I sprained it badly a few years ago and the joint never fully healed. The building security guard, Mr. Obesai, thinks I had a surgery. My mother, bless her, does not ask anymore because the last time she asked I changed the subject so many times she got dizzy and gave up. The truth is simpler and more complicated all at once. The truth is that beneath that sleeve, pressed flat against the soft skin of my inner forearm about 4 inches below the elbow crease, is an omega designation mark. Not the faded, barely there kind that some omegas get, where it looks more like a birthmark or a watercolor smear. Mine is distinct. Dark. The kind that secondary gender specialists write about in case studies because of how clearly defined the shape is. A clean spiral that deepens at the center, ringed by 3 short arcs that my designation counselor told me, when I was 17 and freshly presented, were extremely rare. She said it with this barely contained excitement, like she was describing a fascinating insect she had pinned to a board. I smiled at her and said thank you and went home and spent 4 hours staring at it in the bathroom mirror trying to understand why the thing my body had done to mark me felt so much like a wound. I presented late. Most omegas present between 14 and 16. I was 17 and had just started convincing myself that maybe I was a beta, that maybe I had simply rolled lucky in the genetic lottery and would get to exist in the world without the weight of secondary gender politics pressing down on my shoulders every time I walked into a room. Betas had it easier. Not easy, not by any stretch, but easier. They did not walk into job interviews with the knowledge that the person across the desk might be running the math on how much suppressant-related absenteeism they would have to account for. They did not have to decide, every single morning, how much of themselves they were willing to display. Then one October afternoon in my junior year of high school, I was sitting in chemistry class and I felt the warmth start. I knew immediately what it was. Everyone knows what it feels like, even if they have never experienced it personally. It is in every biology textbook and health class and coming-of-age novel. The warmth that starts just below the skin and radiates outward. The slight disorientation, the way the world's edges go a little soft. I excused myself, walked very calmly to the bathroom, locked myself in a stall, and sat on the floor with my back against the cold metal door for 20 minutes while my body finished doing what it had apparently decided to do 9 months later than expected. The mark was visible by the time I got home. My mother cried happy tears. My father shook my hand and told me our family had a strong omega line and that I should be proud. My older sister, already 2 years into college and comfortably beta, sent me a care package with suppressants and a note that said the first year is an adjustment. Hang in there. She was not wrong. But I did not just adjust. I strategized. I researched. I found the best long-acting suppressants available, the ones that could bring scent output down to near undetectable levels, the ones that did not have the cognitive dulling effect that older formulas carried. I found the compression sleeve at a specialty medical supply shop, designed originally for athletes with repetitive strain injuries, made from a fabric dense enough to completely mask the visual of the mark. I built a life around minimizing, not hiding, I told myself. Managing, the distinction felt important for a long time. I got through college without anyone at school knowing. I got through my internships. I got through the hiring process at Hartwell and Brine by wearing full sleeves and noting beta on the voluntary disclosure form, which is technically not legally binding in either direction and which I knew no one would follow up on. The firm had 3 disclosed alphas, 4 disclosed omegas, and the rest were a mix of betas and non-disclosing individuals, which is the polite way the HR paperwork phrased it. I was a non-disclosing individual. For 3 years I was very successfully, very carefully, a non-disclosing individual, and then one Tuesday morning in March, Armand Cooper joined the firm as the new senior project lead, and everything I had built around my careful, managed, sleeved existence began to very quietly develop cracks. He was not what I expected when they announced a new senior hire. I had been at enough firms to know the type. Senior project leads at architectural companies tended to fall into a few predictable categories. There was the weathered veteran who had opinions about everything and was not interested in yours. There was the technically brilliant but socially deficient genius who communicated primarily through marked-up drawings. There was the corporate smooth operator who had climbed on the strength of client relationships rather than design instinct. And occasionally, rarely, there was the genuinely excellent architect who was also a functional human being, but those were the unicorns of the industry. Armand Cooper walked into the Monday morning all-hands looking like he had never categorized himself in his life. He was tall, which I noticed first because I am not especially tall and the geometry of a room shifts when someone tall walks into it. Dark hair, cut short on the sides but with just enough length on top that it fell slightly across his forehead when he turned his head. He had the kind of jaw that structural engineers probably appreciated professionally. He wore a charcoal suit that fit him like he had been poured into it, and he moved through the room with the unhurried ease of someone who had never needed to prove anything to a room and therefore had nothing to be anxious about. Our managing director, Patricia Hartwell, introduced him with the particular warmth she reserved for people she had worked hard to recruit. He had come from a larger firm in another city, had led a major redevelopment project that won 2 regional awards, had a background in sustainable design that the firm was very keen to develop. He would be overseeing the Meridian Quarter project, which was our biggest active commission and had been, up until that point, something of an organizational mess. He spoke for about 4 minutes during the introduction. He said he was glad to be there, that he had heard strong things about the team, and that he was looking forward to the work. He did not use any of the language that senior hires typically use to signal their authority. He did not say he was excited to lead. He did not say he was bringing a new vision. He just said he was looking forward to the work, and there was something in the plainness of it that made me believe him in a way I did not usually believe people who spoke at all-hands meetings. I was in the 3rd row. He had not looked at me specifically. There was no moment of electric eye contact, no cinematic first impression. He was introduced, he spoke briefly, and then Patricia moved on to project updates. I went back to my desk and thought about the Meridian Quarter files I would need to pull together, because I had been floating on that project in a support capacity for 6 weeks and the arrival of an actual lead meant things were about to accelerate. That was the first day. I did not think about him particularly after that, except in the practical sense of preparing for the project transition meeting, or so I told myself. The second time I really registered Armand Cooper was 3 days later, Thursday afternoon, in the kitchenette on the 4th floor. I was making my second coffee of the day, which was a concession to a deadline that had gotten away from me, and he came in while I was waiting for the machine to finish its cycle. He was carrying a folder and what appeared to be a cold brew from the place on the corner, which meant he had been thoughtful enough to plan ahead and still ended up in the kitchenette anyway, which was the kind of small contradiction I found immediately interesting about people. He set the folder on the counter and opened the cold brew. I said, "You already have coffee." He looked at the cold brew in his hand and then at the machine finishing my cup. "Technically," he said, "I have a cold brew. It's not the same physiologically. You're rationalizing." "I'm clarifying," he said, and there was a brief pull at one corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile but was in the neighborhood. I took my cup. He leaned against the counter in the way of people who are comfortable taking up space without requiring anything from the space or the people in it. He did not make it weird. He did not do the thing some alpha-presenting people did, that particular version of studied casualness that was actually a performance of dominance so refined it had become invisible to everyone who performed it. He was just a person standing in a kitchenette. "You're on Meridian Quarter," he said, "support role. I've been compiling the site analysis data and coordinating with the structural consultants. Patricia said you've been running point informally for the last month. There was a gap. That's one way to describe it, he said. He picked up his folder. The transition meeting is Monday. I'd like to do a working session before that if you have an hour tomorrow. I want to understand the project from someone who's actually been living in it, not from the summary documents. I said yes. He said 10 o'clock. He picked up his cold brew and his folder and left. I stood there for a moment with my coffee. Something in my chest had done something small and inconvenient, and I filed it away under things not to examine right now and went back to my desk. The working session on Friday was productive in the specific, focused way that happens when two people are genuinely interested in the same problem. He asked good questions. Not the questions designed to demonstrate that he already knew the answer, but the actual kind, the ones with open endings, the ones that suggested he was building a map rather than confirming a route he had already chosen. I found myself pulling up references I had not pulled up since my initial site visit. I found myself explaining not just the data but the texture of it, the way the eastern boundary of the site had a soil composition issue that the preliminary surveys had underplayed, the way the existing community consultation had surfaced a really specific concern about sight lines from the primary school 2 blocks north that had not yet been properly incorporated into any of the massing proposals. He listened. He made notes. He pushed back on 2 things and agreed immediately on 3 others, and the 2 things he pushed back on were the 2 things I had been mildly uncertain about myself. By 11:45 I had told him more about the Meridian Quarter project than I had told anyone, including my own manager, and it felt slightly alarming and mostly fine. This is good, he said, closing his notebook. Thank you. You have a very clear way of building an argument. I said something like it was just the material and he said no, it really was not, because plenty of people had access to the same material and did not build arguments like that, and the directness of it landed in a way I was not prepared for. I went home that Friday and told myself very firmly that I was going to be professional. Monday came. The transition meeting went well. Over the next 3 weeks, the Meridian Quarter project went from a slow, rudderless drift to something that had direction and momentum, which was entirely Armin's influence but would not have been possible, he said in a team meeting, without the foundation of groundwork that had already been done. He said it matter-of-factly and looked in my direction when he said it. Not pointed, not performative. Just acknowledgement delivered like it was the most natural thing in the world. Dana leaned over after the meeting and said, quietly, he likes you. I said, he respects the work. She said, sure, honey, and went back to her desk. The first incident happened 6 weeks after he started. We had been working late. This was becoming a pattern, not by design, just by the organic gravitational pull of a large project that required a lot of coordination and 2 people who both defaulted to staying until the thing was done rather than picking it up the next morning. The office emptied out around 7. By 8:30 it was just the 2 of us and the ambient hum of the building's climate system. I was pulling a full bleed print from the wide format printer when the edge of a drawing caught on the roller and jammed. I reached in at an awkward angle to free it. And in doing so I pushed my sleeve up past my elbow, and then the drawing released suddenly and I stumbled back slightly and grabbed the edge of the printer table to catch myself, and in the scramble I did not immediately notice that my sleeve had ridden up further than it usually did. I noticed when Armand, who had been walking over to help with the jam, stopped, not dramatically. Not in the way of someone who has seen something shocking. Just stopped, mid-step, for about half a second. I felt it before I looked down. The particular quality of stillness that enters a room when something unplanned has been revealed. I looked at my arm. The sleeve had ridden up past the mark. Not far. Maybe an inch of exposure, but enough. The spiral was visible. That distinctive, over-documented, apparently rare spiral. I pulled the sleeve down. Smooth, practiced, the motion of someone who had rehearsed this in the private theater of their own anxiety hundreds of times even though they had never expected to need it. Got it, I said, about the drawing. I pulled the print free. I did not look at him, he did not say anything. We went back to work. He asked a question about the structural grid on the east elevation 20 seconds later, his voice completely normal, and I answered it, and we finished the drawings, and at 9:15 we said goodnight and I took the elevator down and walked to the train and sat in my usual seat near the door and stared at the dark tunnel walls sliding past the window. My heart was going faster than it should have been. He had not said anything. That was good. That was exactly what I needed from the situation, nothing, just nothing. People saw things and moved on. People had the decency and the sense to not make things into what they were not, except, when I replayed it on the train, the way I always replayed things I needed to file away, there was a detail I could not smooth over. He had not just stopped. He had looked. And the looking had been the particular kind that was not a quick, startled glance and then away. It had been a second. Maybe a second and a half. The kind of pause that contained more than surprise. I told myself I was overanalyzing. I was absolutely overanalyzing. He did not bring it up. Not that week, not the next. We worked on the Meridian Quarter project. We had our regular morning coffee meetings that had started, I was not sure exactly when, sometime in the fourth week, where we would spend the first 20 minutes of the day doing a fast roundup of the previous day's open items. The coffee meetings were efficient and I looked forward to them in a way that I found worth noting and not examining, but there was something different about the way he looked at my left arm, not constantly. Not in a way that anyone else would have noticed. But I noticed, because I was constitutionally alert to that particular region of my own body in the way that years of conscious management had made me. And his gaze, sometimes, in the middle of a sentence, would drop to my forearm for less than a second and then come back up. The first time I clocked it I thought I was imagining it, the fourth time I thought, he knows, I spent a weekend with that knowledge sitting on my chest like a physical weight. He knew. He had seen enough to know. The spiral was distinctive enough that there was no reasonable alternative interpretation. He was an adult person in a world where secondary gender presentation was a visible, discussed, present reality, and he had seen what he had seen, and he had chosen not to say anything about it, and now he kept looking at it. What did it mean that he kept looking at it? I ran several theories. 1. He was uncertain and was trying to confirm what he had seen. 2. He was concerned, in some professional capacity, about what it meant for team dynamics. 3. He found it interesting in an impersonal, academic way. 4. He was an alpha and he was instinctively drawn to the signal and was exercising the admirable restraint of not acting on it, while still, unconsciously, being pulled toward it. I ran theory 4 several times. Not because I wanted it to be true. Just because it kept presenting itself with the persistence of something that wanted to be examined. Armand Cooper was alpha designated. This was not something I knew officially, because the firm did not make designation a standard disclosure. But it was the kind of thing that becomes apparent over time in the small ways that bodies communicate what paperwork does not. He did not have a strong scent presence, which meant he was likely on moderate alpha suppressants, which was extremely common and responsible and completely unremarkable. But there were other things. The way he occupied space. The particular frequency of his calm, which had the specific quality of an alpha calm, different from the flat neutral of beta calm, warmer and more directional. The way people in rooms tended to orient toward him slightly without realizing they were doing it. I was aware of all of this in the thorough, cataloging way that my omega biology had been aware of alphas since I was 17. The part of me that ran a continuous background process regardless of what my conscious mind preferred, I had gotten very good at not listening to that background process. I told myself to keep not listening to it. The second incident happened on a Wednesday, 7 weeks after the first. We were doing a site visit. The Meridian Quarter site was a 12-minute walk from the office, a cleared urban block with the bones of a former warehouse complex still partially standing on the north end. The weather had turned, one of those early May days that could not decide whether it was spring or summer, warm in the sun and genuinely cold in the shade. I had my jacket and my usual long sleeves, but I had misjudged the temperature at my desk and by the time we were 20 minutes into the site walk I was warm enough to be uncomfortable. Armand was talking about the warehouse retention proposal, gesturing at the north facade and explaining why he thought the loading dock apertures could be preserved as a formal feature of the new retail frontage. I was listening and looking and also quietly suffering through being too warm. I did what I sometimes did when I was alone. I pushed the right sleeve up first, which I always did first, and then reached for the left, and then I remembered where I was and who I was standing next to and I stopped, my fingers on the compression material. He was still talking. Looking at the facade, I pulled my right sleeve down again. I turned back to the building and said something about the eastern loading dock proportions. He responded. We kept walking, 5 minutes later he said, without particular emphasis, you can push your sleeves up. It's warm. There was a moment where the ambient sounds of the site, the distant traffic, the wind through the warehouse gaps, seemed to go very quiet. I said, I'm fine. He looked at me. The site visit look, not the office look. The outdoors version of him, jacket open, a slight squint against the light. I'm not going to say anything, he said. I haven't said anything. I'm not going to start. I looked at him for long enough that I understood he meant exactly what he said. I did not push my sleeves up. But something in my chest did a complicated, involuntary thing that felt like a door opening a quarter inch. We finished the site visit. On the walk back he told me about a stone detail in an old library building he had walked past in another city that had given him an idea for the Meridian Quarter lobby. He described it precisely and well, the way he described everything, and I listened and the residual warmth of the sight was still on my face and I thought, in the clear, unavoidable way of someone who has stopped being able to avoid a thing, I am in significant trouble here. His behavior did not change after that. He did not treat me differently. He did not make it a thing between us. He was exactly as he had been, present and direct and genuinely interested in the work, and the morning coffee meetings continued and the late evenings continued and the project continued to move, but the looking had changed. Before, it had been subtle to the point where I could almost convince myself it was incidental. After the site visit it was not incidental. He did not stare. He was not obvious about it. But when there was a pause in conversation, when I was looking at drawings and not at him, occasionally I would look up and his eyes would be at my forearm and they would come back to my face without apology, without embarrassment, just a quiet and complete acknowledgement that yes, he had been looking, and yes, he was aware that I knew, and no, he did not intend to stop. It was the most intimate thing anyone had ever done to me without touching me. I thought about it on the train. I thought about it at my desk. I thought about it in the produce section of the grocery store on Saturday morning. Standing in front of the carrots for a completely unreasonable amount of time, I had not wanted anyone's attention on that part of me for 3 years. I had structured my entire professional existence around not wanting it. The sleeve was the physical manifestation of a decision I had made at 17 and renewed every morning since, the decision to take up only the space that I chose to take up, to present only the self I curated, to refuse the designation that wanted to define me before I could define myself, and Armand had seen through the sleeve and then seen me, in the way I had been afraid of, in the way I had been protecting against, and he had said nothing and done nothing except look at the spot where I was most carefully hidden. And I was not afraid, that was the thing I could not get past. I kept waiting for the fear to arrive, the familiar clench of exposure anxiety, the calculation of damage control. It did not come. What came instead was something warmer and more terrifying than fear, the feeling of being seen by someone and having them respond by being careful with what they saw. If you are still watching, subscribe so you never miss a story like this. Now let's see what happens next. Dana asked me one Friday over lunch if anything was going on with Armand and me. I said, we work well together. She gave me the look she reserved for statements that were technically true and operationally useless. Connie. I have eyes, the project is going well, the project. Sure. She stabbed a piece of cucumber. He asks about your opinion specifically when you're not in the room. Did you know that? In the Monday internal reviews, when you're sometimes stuck on the model render updates, he asks what Connie thinks about the massing option, what Connie's read on the consultant feedback is. Specifically, I did not say anything, and, she continued, I'm not saying this to be weird, but I notice things because I have the spatial awareness of someone who has survived 3 different open-plan offices, and he looks at you the way a person looks at something they are trying very hard to respect from a distance. I looked at my sandwich. Is this going to become a situation? She asked, not unkindly. Nothing is happening, I said. I didn't ask if anything was happening. I asked if it was going to become a situation. The distinction, it occurred to me, was exactly the kind of distinction I understood very well from a different direction. I said, I don't know. Dana nodded like that was a reasonable and honest answer and went back to her lunch, and she did not bring it up again, which was the thing I liked most about her. April turned into May and the Meridian Quarter project entered its next phase, which meant more external meetings and more client presentations and more evenings that stretched past 9 The pattern had become so established that neither of us commented on it. The cleaning crew knew our names. The security guard on night shift had started leaving a pot of regular coffee running in the fourth-floor kitchenette when he did his evening rounds. I had stopped cataloging the number of times he looked at the sleeve. Not because he had stopped, but because I had stopped needing to track it the way you stop needing to track something when you have accepted it as part of the landscape. There was a Tuesday in mid-May where we were side by side at the long table in the project room, both looking at the same set of drawings, and he reached across me to point at something on the east elevation. His arm passing close over my left forearm, and he paused, arm still extended, and looked at me, not at my arm. At me. Does it bother you? He asked. That I know. The question was so quiet and so direct that for a moment I did not have my usual architecture of deflection ready. No, I said. And then, because honesty sometimes arrived without permission, it used to. Before you. It would have. He looked at me for another second and then at the drawing. His arm came back. He pointed at the detail he had wanted to show me and explained what he was thinking about the cantilever, and I responded, and we went back to work, but the room felt different. Or maybe I was different in it. The third incident, which was not so much an incident as an opening, happened 2 weeks later. It was a Thursday evening, 8:40, just the two of us in the project room again. I had been at my desk for 11 hours and I was tired in the specific way that made small things feel larger than they were, the way that made the distance between what you were being careful about and what you actually wanted feel unbridgeable. I was making notes on a consultant's report and my pen ran out. The dry scraping of an empty pen against paper is a petty frustration, but at 11 hours it landed badly, and I made a sound of irritation and reached across to the supply cup at the end of the table. And in reaching I knocked my travel mug, and the travel mug knocked my laptop bag, and the bag hit the sleeve where I always tuck the gathered extra material, and I heard the small sound of Velcro releasing. I felt the sleeve loosen. Just slightly. Just enough. I looked down. The mark was not exposed. The sleeve had shifted but not enough to reveal anything. I reached to adjust it. Armand had looked up at the sound. He was watching me as I fixed the sleeve, my movements careful and practiced and routine in the particular way of things that have become too practiced. You've been adjusting it all day, he said. I looked up. The last 2 weeks, he said. The Velcro's wearing. You can tell when you're consciously tracking it. I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, I need a new one. Yeah, the word was not commentary. It was just acknowledgement. I looked at the worn fabric of the sleeve. 3 years of daily wear. I had replaced it twice already, and the current one was nearly 18 months old, which was past the recommended replacement window that I had been ignoring because replacing it felt like renewing a commitment that some stubborn part of me was increasingly reluctant to renew. I don't always know why I still wear it, I said. I was not sure why I said it. It was the kind of thing that comes out at 11 hours and 40 minutes into a day, the things that do not make it past the perimeter in better circumstances. Armand put down his pen. He did not say anything, which was the right thing to not do. I started because I didn't want it to be the first thing people knew about me. I said. Or the main thing. Or the thing that reorganized everything else. I'd seen it happen to other Omegas and I didn't want to be rearranged by it. That makes sense, he said. It still makes sense, I said. Most of the reasons still apply. But I've been wearing it so long that I don't always know if I'm wearing it because of the reasons or just because I've been wearing it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, those are different things. Yeah, one of them is a choice, he said. The other is a habit that's wearing out its Velcro. I laughed before I could stop myself. Not a polite laugh. An actual one, startled out of me. He smiled at that, a real one, not the near smile from the kitchenette. A full, unguarded version that changed the whole geometry of his face. I looked at him for a moment longer than was strictly professional. He looked back. Neither of us said the obvious thing, because we were two careful people in a late-night project room and the obvious thing had been sitting there patiently for months already and it could continue to sit there a little longer. But something had shifted between the door being open a quarter inch and the door being open an inch. I bought a new sleeve. The same kind, same specifications. It sat in the packaging on my bathroom counter for 4 days before I put it on. During those 4 days I wore the old one, Velcro and all. And spent a considerable amount of time thinking about what Armand had said. The difference between a choice and a habit wearing out its Velcro. It was the kind of thing that sounded simple and was actually a question of identity that I had been deferring for 3 years. I had presented at 17 and spent the subsequent years building a life in which my designation was known only to me, to my family, to my doctor, and now, involuntarily and irrevocably, to Armand Cooper. I had told myself at various points along the way that this was practical, that it was strategic, that it was a reasonable response to a world that did not always handle Omega designation with grace or equity. All of those things were still true, but there was a version of the story where I had started from practicality and arrived somewhere else, somewhere that had more to do with armor than strategy, somewhere that had more to do with the fear of being rearranged than with any actual threat. I had been so focused on not being defined by the mark that I had let it define the shape of my secrecy instead, which was its own kind of being defined by it, just in negative space. Armand had seen the mark and not rearranged me. He had seen it and treated me exactly as he had treated me before, with the same direct attention and the same quality of regard, and the only thing that had changed was that he sometimes looked at the covered spot with an expression I was now able to name. Which was something between careful and wanting. I put on the new sleeve on a Friday morning. It fit better. The Velcro was clean and crisp. I went to work, the morning coffee meeting. Me with my black coffee, him with his regular coffee that he seemed to actually enjoy unlike his cold brew which was an affectation, I had decided. He walked me through 2 outstanding items on the consultant coordination. I told him about an issue I had flagged in the structural report. He made a note, then he looked at my arm. The new sleeve. Back up to my face, new one, he said, yeah, good, not congratulatory. Not weighted. Just good, the way you say good when something that needed to happen has happened and you are glad it did and you are not going to make a production of it. I looked at him. I haven't decided anything, I said. About the sleeve. About the rest of it. I'm still figuring out which reasons are still mine, he nodded. That's reasonable, I just wanted you to know I'm thinking about it. The difference you described, okay, he said. And then, for what it's worth. From where I'm sitting. You are not a mark on your arm. You're also not the absence of one. You're just the most precise, irritating, occasionally brilliant person I've worked with in a long time, and any version of you that you show up as tomorrow is going to have those qualities and I'm going to keep finding them annoying and valuable in roughly equal measure. I stared at him. He looked at his coffee. That came out slightly more like a declaration than I intended, only slightly, I said, the near smile. The one from the kitchenette that first week. I realized, sitting with my coffee in the morning light coming through the project room windows, that I had been cataloging his expressions the way I had been cataloging his glances at my arm. Without meaning to. Without wanting to stop, can I ask you something? I said, yes, why haven't you said anything? Since you saw it. You've had months to say something, he considered the question. This was a thing I had noticed about him, that he did not answer reflexively, that he gave questions the time they needed. Because it wasn't mine to say something about, he said. You covered it. That means you chose to cover it. Me deciding to uncover it by naming it out loud would have been taking that choice away from you. I sat with that for a moment, and, he said, with the precision of someone who has been honest once and might as well be honest the rest of the way, I was concerned that if I said something, you might think I was interested in the designation rather than in you, and those are extremely different things. And I needed you to have enough information to tell the difference before the subject came up. The morning sun was very bright. The project room was very quiet. How long have you been waiting to say that? I said, approximately 3 months, he said, that's a long time to be precise. It seemed worth being precise about. Nothing happened that day in the sense of events. We had a client call at 10 and a consultant review at 2 and I stayed until 7:30 and he stayed until 8 and we said goodnight at the elevator and went our separate ways, but something had shifted in the quality of the air between us, something that had been building for months and had just tipped past the point of no return. Not into anything defined. Not into anything with a name yet. Just past the point where we could pretend the thing was not there. I thought about it on the train. I thought about the word designation. The way he had distinguished between being interested in the designation and being interested in me. It was the most direct acknowledgement that he was interested in me, that the word itself had finally been used, and he had used it not to stake a claim but to clarify a distinction, to make sure I knew what kind of attention I was getting. I had been afraid for 3 years of exactly the kind of attention he was describing, the designation first kind, the kind that turned people into case studies, the kind that had been in my designation counselor's voice when she described the rarity of my mark. The reduction of a person to a biological annotation. He had known about the mark for 3 months and had spent those 3 months being interested in the fight I picked with the city planning consultant about the heritage overlay methodology. In the specific way I organized presentation materials, in whether I had eaten lunch, in the quality of my ideas about the warehouse facade apertures, he had been interested in the person first, and the mark was just the thing he kept looking at because he was careful and wanted and trying to be the right kind of both. I was somewhere in my late 20s, on a night train, in a city, with a sleeve on my arm and a realization sitting in my chest that felt like the first genuinely warm thing I had allowed in a very long time. The week after the morning coffee declaration, as I had started privately calling it, Armand and I had 4 separate extended working sessions that lasted variously late and covered a remarkable amount of Meridian Quarter content and also occasionally other things. On Wednesday he told me about growing up in a small town where his parents were the only Alpha-Omega pairing in a mostly Beta extended family, and how his understanding of the weight of designation came from watching his mother navigate it her whole life, and how he had decided early on that he was not going to be the kind of Alpha who treated Omega designation like a resource or a comfort item. I told him that was an unusually clear-eyed thing for someone to have decided early on, he said. His mother was a remarkably clear-eyed person. I told him about presenting late and about the biology class bathroom floor and about my sister's care package with the note. He laughed at the care package. He said that was a very older sibling thing to do, practical and slightly insufficient and entirely well-meaning. I told him about the sleeve. Not the practical reasons, those he knew, but the other reasons, the identity reasons, the fear of being rearranged. He listened the way he always listened, with his full attention and without the urge to fix or respond until I had finished. Do you think you're ready, he said, to stop being a non-disclosing individual? I don't know, I said honestly. I think I'm ready to stop letting the sleeve be the answer to that question. He looked at me carefully. Those aren't the same thing, I know. But I think one has to come before the other. For me, that's fair. On Thursday we had dinner, which was ostensibly practical. There was a restaurant 2 blocks from the office that stayed open late and we had been to it twice before as a group. But this time it was just the 2 of us and we both knew it was not really about the dinner. We sat at a corner table and talked about architecture and history and the cities we had grown up in and the buildings we loved and the ones we thought were beautiful failures, and somewhere around the 3rd hour he reached across the table and touched the back of my hand, the right one, very briefly, and then took his hand back. I'm going to be transparent, he said, because I have been trying to be transparent for 3 months and I have apparently gotten into the habit. You have, I confirmed. I want to be more than a colleague to you, he said. I have wanted that for a while. I haven't said it because I didn't want to complicate the work, and also because I was waiting for you to have enough information, and I think now you have enough information. I looked at him across the table in the low light of a restaurant at 10:15 on a Thursday. All the careful structures I had built. The sleeve. The non-disclosing status. The 3rd train instead of the 2nd. The whole architecture of managed distance. And this man who had seen through the first layer of it and responded by being patient and specific and honest, who had looked at the covered place on my arm for months with something I now understood was not possession or fascination but something closer to recognition. The look of someone who saw a protected thing and understood why it was protected and was willing to wait at the perimeter until invited in. I have enough information, I said. He looked at me. Yeah, the near smile. The full version was there too, underneath. But he kept it to the near one, and somehow that was better. We paid the bill and walked back toward the train station. The night was warm enough to be comfortable, and somewhere in the 2 blocks between the restaurant and the station he took my hand. Not my left hand. My right one. Simple and deliberate and entirely unhurried, we walked like that to the station. Things did not transform overnight. This is not that kind of story. The kind where realizations cascade into revelations and revelations become new identities fully formed. I am a methodical person and Armand is a methodical person and we were methodical about this too. which is to say we were honest about what we were and patient with the things that were still becoming. I did not take off the sleeve the next day. Or the day after that. I wore it to work and I wore it to the second dinner, which was a dinner, not a working dinner, just a dinner, on a Saturday, which was when it became officially a thing between us rather than an almost thing. He did not ask about the sleeve. He had said he would not say anything and he was, infuriatingly and wonderfully, a person who meant what he said. I took it off for the first time in front of another person on a Sunday afternoon 6 weeks after the restaurant dinner. We were at his apartment, which I had been to twice by then, and I had been warm since walking in and the sleeve was bothering me in the way it sometimes did when I was warm and relaxed and the edge of it felt restrictive rather than protective. I was sitting on his couch with my legs tucked under me reading a section of a structural engineering reference he had recommended, and I reached for the sleeve and undid the Velcro. The sound of Velcro in a quiet room. He looked up from across the room where he was making coffee. He did not say anything. He went back to the coffee. I held the sleeve in my hand for a moment. The mark was visible on my forearm, the spiral and the 3 arcs, clear and distinct against my skin, the thing I had hidden from every version of every room I had been in for 3 years and 2 months and, at this point, some number of days I had stopped tracking. There it is, I said, quietly, to no one. Armand came back with 2 cups of coffee. He sat in the chair across from me. He glanced at my arm the way he always had, the way he had been doing since the printer in the project room, except this time the sleeve was in my hand and the mark was visible and there was no need to look at a covered place. He looked full, unhurried, for a moment, then he handed me my coffee and said, "Your annotation on the Vickers reference, the part about lateral load distribution. I've been thinking about whether you're right." I took the coffee. "I'm right," I said. "You might be right," he said. "I'm not fully convinced. You'll be convinced by Thursday, possibly." He turned back to his book. "The mark is really striking, by the way. In case no one's ever said that without making it weird." I looked at my forearm. The spiral. The 3 arcs. The thing my designation counselor had called extremely rare with barely contained excitement. She said it was rare, I told him. The counselor. When I presented, "I can see why, she made me feel like a specimen, that's her failure, not the marks." I looked at him. He was reading. He said it like it was a simple piece of calibration, like it was the most straightforward thing, that the counselor's weird excitement was about her, not about me or my body, that the mark was just a thing, that the thing was interesting without being defining. Something in my chest unwound about 3 more inches. I put the sleeve on the arm of the couch. I went back to the engineering reference. Outside the window the Sunday afternoon continued in its ordinary way, the sounds of the city, the light changing through the clouds. I had been a non-disclosing individual for 3 years. I had worn the same sleeve in different replacements every day of my adult working life. I had built an architecture of managed distance and careful presentation and strategic smallness, and I was sitting on a couch with a cup of coffee and my mark visible and the person across the room from me was arguing with me about lateral load distribution and looking at me like I was exactly who I was, completely, without needing me to be more or less of anything. I told Dana a month later, not in a big way. Not as a disclosure. We were having lunch, the usual Thursday lunch, and she asked how things were going with Armand, this time with the quiet precision of someone who already knew the answer and was asking for the pleasure of hearing me confirm it. I said, "Good. Things are good." She waited. "We're together," I said. "Officially." Since about 6 weeks ago. She made a sound of vindicated satisfaction that I felt was a little much, and, I said, because I had decided, I'm going to update my disclosure status with HR. The secondary gender thing. She looked at me carefully. Not surprised. Something softer than surprised. Yeah, because of Armand, I thought about it. Partially. But mostly because the reason I was wearing it was wearing out its Velcro. She looked briefly confused by the metaphor and then seemed to decide it made enough sense. "Good," she said. Not that it was anyone's business either way. But good. It took me another 3 weeks to actually file the paperwork. Not out of fear exactly, but out of the particular care that comes from doing something for the first time that you have been putting off for a very long time, the way you move slowly in a dark room not because you are afraid of the dark but because you have been in the dark long enough that you respect it. I filed on a Tuesday. The HR administrator said thank you and updated the system and offered me a brochure about designation support resources, which I took politely and did not need. I walked back to my desk. Armand was in a client call. He would be for another 40 minutes. I sat at my desk and looked at the window and thought about 17-year-old Connie on the bathroom floor of the high school chemistry corridor. And what I would tell him if I could, not everything that was coming, not the 3 years of the sleeve or the late nights or the accidentally right job or the printer jam that started everything. Just, the things you build to protect yourself are not always the things you will need forever. Some of them become walls after they stop being shields. You will know the difference when the Velcro starts wearing out. There is a morning, about 3 months after we become official, that I keep coming back to. We are in his apartment, which has started to feel like mine too, in the slow accretion of habits and coffee mugs and a specific drawer that has become, without either of us formally assigning it, my drawer. It is early, the particular early of a weekend morning before the city has fully committed to being awake, and the light is the gray gold that comes before direct sun. I am standing at the kitchen counter waiting for the coffee. I am wearing a short-sleeved shirt. The mark is visible. After the first Sunday afternoon on the couch, the sleeve became something I chose rather than something I defaulted to, which meant that at home, in the summer, in warm rooms, it usually stayed in the drawer. Armand comes out of the bedroom. He is barely awake in the way he is barely awake on weekend mornings, which is to say that 90% of his architecture is present and functioning, but the final 10% is still arriving. He goes to the coffee. He pours 2 cups with the accuracy of someone who has made this particular pair of cups enough times that it has become a reflex. He turns and hands me mine and his gaze drops to my forearm, the old gesture, the one that started in the project room at 8:30 at night with a printer jam and a half-second pause, except now it is not a covered place. The mark is right there, visible and clear and apparently still interesting to him. 3 months in, which I had wondered about, and he had answered by continuing to look at it with the same quality of attention he had given it when it was covered. You're still doing that, I say. He looks up. What? Looking at it, he looks back at my arm for a moment. Then back at my face. Is that okay? I think about it. The honest answer. The answer that is mine rather than the one built out of old habits and old armor. Yeah, I said. I think I like that you still do. He nodded. Like that was the right answer. Like he had been waiting for me to arrive at it on my own, he sat down at the counter and opened the newspaper. I sat across from him with my coffee. The light was getting warmer. The mark was on my arm, spiral and 3 arcs, rare and mine. The sleeve was in the drawer. Outside, the city was waking up. And I was, in the particular quiet of a kitchen on a weekend morning, exactly as much of myself as I had ever been anywhere. I covered my Omega mark for 3 years. He found it by accident, in a badly lit project room, over a printer jam, when I was just trying to free a drawing. He has not stopped looking at that spot, and somewhere between the first time he looked and now, the difference I had been defending against for 3 years, the difference between being seen and being exposed, the difference between being known and being reduced, became something I could finally feel instead of just theorize about. Being seen by someone who looks at the thing you protected most carefully and responds by being more careful with you, not less, that is not exposure, that is the whole point.